Welcome to the Relationship Series podcast. My name is Ankush Jain, and each episode I'll be speaking with a different state of mind expert on the subject of relationships. Enjoy. Welcome to the next episode of the Relationship Series. This week I'm here with Chip and Jain Chipman, who are joining us all the way over from Salt Spring Island in British Columbia. I'm really excited to be interviewing both Chip and Jain. They've had many years experience, decades of experience should I say, running many executive as well as couples retreats in North America and Europe. And they spent many years in Florida where they served a variety of organizations, both in companies, not-for-profit, prisons, as well as couples and relationships. And now they reside in Salt Spring Island, teaching what is known as the Three Principles approach. So welcome, Chip and Jain.
Oh, thanks, Ankush. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Ankush.
We've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. I always say kind of a bit of a formal introduction, and then I like to just say a little bit about my relationship with the speakers. And Chip and I have been speaking for a few weeks, and Chip has been mentoring me as part of my trainer training that I'm doing at the moment. And one thing I love about Chip when we have conversations is he's a great storyteller. So I'm really looking forward to this call because I'm sure we're going to get some wonderful stories come out, and I always love listening to them.
Well, thanks.
So could we just start a little bit, and either Chip or Jain, and just maybe tell us some kind of highlights around working with couples as you have over many years, and some of the things that you've discovered in working with couples and working on their relationships.
Mm-hmm. Well, perhaps a little bit of background. I think this is worth putting out there for further discussion as we go along. Jain and I have been married for 46 years. But at about our 6th or 7th year, we were pretty close to a divorce. And we encountered some understanding and some ideas about relationships that not only saved our marriage, because people do get good counseling, but it made our marriage become a joy through all these years. Not that we don't have a bad day now and then, but we really definitely had an experience that allowed us to drop literally years of disagreement and argument and upset and emotions and bad feelings. We had an experience that allowed us to move on from that almost instantly, within a matter of a few weeks. So here we are, 40 years later, and whatever you'd want to call that experience we had has given us those 40 years, actually. So that's a little bit of background. Jain?
Excuse me. Yes, I think the very first thing that comes to mind for me when somebody asks us what would be the highlight of what we've learned and what we have to share with other couples or anyone in any kind of a relationship is that when you start with yourself and you find your own happiness, which I wasn't finding all those years ago when we got to that point where we were, our marriage was in so much trouble that I had lost sight of that, and I was waiting for Chip to be happy before I would be happy. And so I would say that it's just amazing to me how just remembering that the most important person in your life in a way is yourself. It sounds kind of selfish, but if you find that balance and happiness in your own life, you will see it play out in your relationships. And often over the years, we've had people say, well, I'm fine, but it's just, I can't get my spouse to be happy. Could you help me get my spouse happier? And the way it works is it really always does go back to finding it for yourself. And you will start to see the answers of how to help your partner, anyone in any relationship.
So would you say that if someone's listening to this and they're in a relationship and they find that perhaps their partner's unhappy or their partner's the cause of some anxiety or stress in the relationship, would you say in every situation it just comes back down to themselves, and as they get happier and more in touch with their own happiness regardless of their partner, then are you saying that will automatically improve the relationship?
Well, I would put it this way. I mean, obviously the listeners are starting to pick up that the essence of our approach is that personal happiness is not dependent on anything outside of yourself. It's dependent on you getting in touch with something within you, your own wisdom, your own common sense, your own true self, whatever you want to call it. And so, in a sense, it's very different from most relationship counseling. Like when we work with couples, for instance, we very seldom talk about the issues they think they want to talk about. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't listen with compassion to what they're going through. But we see that when people are able just to back up and just let go, just temporarily, they don't have to say they're right or they're wrong, but temporarily let go of the thoughts that they're engaged in about their spouse and just kind of look after themselves. I would put it this way. I would say that their batting average for success in the relationship would go way up. So in our case, as an example, Jan discovered something about looking inside of herself and finding her own happiness. And as she was saying, until that moment, both of us, like Jan was very dependent on my being happy and vice versa. Now I came out of a very, very disruptive, upset, angry family with all the, with violence and alcohol and everything. So when we first met, I was really given to depression. And Jan loved me. We loved each other. So she became given to trying to help me with my depression, which only led her to be in the same shape eventually, So in our case, Jan heard somebody speak and really, really heard that happiness was within. It was something that she could find within herself. And we won't go into the whole story, but she comes home from this accidental encounter and she's happy. And this is like left in the morning one way, come back in the evening another person. And frankly, I didn't believe it when I first saw it. I thought, okay, she's been affected by somebody charismatic, whatever. We had been searchers for a long time. We'd always been looking for happiness and spiritual understanding. But I just thought this wasn't real. But the lifesaver for me and eventually our marriage was that Jan's happiness was so sustained after a few weeks, and in fact growing, that it forced me to take a look at that. It forced me to back up from all of my belief systems about how happiness was created, how you found spiritual understanding. Because no matter how many times I tried to get Jan back to our old relationship, which is what I did when she changed. It's weird. I just wanted her back literally to all that fighting and stuff because it was the world that I knew. It was the world that I knew where all the buttons were. So when I finally saw that it was sustained and that she had truly changed and become happy, I was left with a very, very definite choice. Do I want to have some curiosity and look at this and see what's going on here, or do I want to leave? And I'll be very honest, it was pretty close because I was just such a mess. But eventually, the fact that Jan had found something like this aroused my curiosity. And in that curiosity, I was led to the same thing, that I had to find happiness within myself. Now, once that started, it's amazing when I look back on it now, because once that started, it's like the stuff that we were upset with each other just seemed to evaporate. And we jokingly but honestly say these days that we actually can't remember what exactly it was that we were fighting about all the time.
The difference between this incidence of me finding happiness was that as Chip said, we were searching at that time, and we might read something that made us feel better, and that would help our relationship for a while. But the difference this time, when I heard something and I had my insight about happiness being inside me, is what I really heard on a really deep level and felt in a way that I never felt before, is that there is something inside all human beings that is so pure and so uncontaminated, and I felt that innocence about myself, and I felt that I just saw that this whole other part of myself that I had been overlooking with all my insecure thoughts. And when I saw that, when I saw my own inner beauty, I guess you could call it, and innocence, then when I went back into the world of, relationships, I was then able to be more able to see innocence in other people. And so it really was a shift rather than just, find the words, just finding happiness. There was a real difference because it was a deeper realization than I'd ever had before about life and how it really is coming from the inside. Your experience of life is coming from the inside. And before I had that insight, I would blame my unhappiness not just partially on Chip, but circumstances, people hurting my feelings, just everything was responsible for me being unhappy. So I had a deep insight about where true happiness really comes from.
Let's talk about romantic love just for a minute because it has a bearing on the conversation. When we met and fell in love, I would pretty much say that neither one of us could see a fault in the other. And that's the nature of falling in love is you throw out judgment. You see this beautiful person that you want to be with. So you throw out all the judgment. You don't look at their foibles quite as closely. It's you just want to be with that person. And the way I would put it is you want to be with the essence of that person, And then you get married or you end up living together or whatever. And over time, you start to notice the differences and the faults and the insecurities. And pretty soon you think that's the relationship, but it's not. It's just a series of thoughts and incidents that create thoughts that have altered the nature of the relationship. So when you have an insight into your own true nature, when you get quiet of yourself, one of the automatic outcomes of it is much the same as falling in love, because the judgment drops away and you see that person you had that beautiful feeling for in the very beginning. And it's so interesting for us to look at it that way, because that's exactly what happened. It's like 7 years after getting married, and we were very much in love and very happy when we first got married. 7 years after, it was like falling in love again, but I would put it this way. It was falling in love with an understanding of how letting go of judgment and seeing the person in the moment was absolutely okay. And that it allowed you to see the essence of that person, and that always brings on beautiful feelings. Now I know that out there in the wild world of that's a Freudian slip, but I think it's right on, the wild world of relationships. I meant to say the wide world. There's a wide spectrum in terms of the quality of relationships. But what I'm saying is if when people are committed to being in a relationship, the ability to look at yourself, find your own happiness, has a powerful impact on the quality of the relationship. Even if one person changes in that degree, you could see that kind of a change would cut short a lot of that disagreement, a lot of the two separate realities bouncing off of each other. Because in essence, what falling in love is and rediscovering love is going to a common reality together, a more beautiful reality together that exists at a deeper level than all of that thought and all of that conditioning.
So I love what you guys are pointing to and how you're kind of describing that. And I guess the question that I've got is that if someone's listening to this and they're thinking, well, that sounds great, you guys found this inner happiness, or you managed to fall in love again. And what would you say to someone who was listening to this and is like, well, how do I find that for myself?
Well, to be direct, our mentor was a gentleman named Sidney Banks, who discovered a set of principles that have had and are having a profound effect on the fields of psychology and psychiatry. And those principles point to the existence of health within everybody, and point to the ability to have a quiet mind and insights that lead you to that wisdom that's on the inside. So, I don't want to push anything in anybody's direction, but that's what happened to us. Is we we listened to somebody that helped us understand that the true self is truly not of this world. It's like when we're little babies, we don't have all these conditions and beliefs and culture and everything. We have pure consciousness, and that true self, because it's non-tangible, it's not of this world, really can't ever be damaged. What gets damaged is the belief system and the ego and all the insecurity that comes from it. Now, I'm not saying that people can change overnight, but we have seen many people change very quickly by learning to understand something of these three principles, which, by the way, are universal mind, universal consciousness, and universal thought. It's hard for us not to talk about those things because those are the things that brought us to a deeper understanding of each other. And I'll tell you, for me, it went beyond that because I grew up with a terrible, terrible relationship with my father, which included violence and anger and hatred. And that same ability to look inside and see that my feelings are created by my thinking within myself allowed me to see my father's psychological innocence, to see that he was just lost in a world that had been handed to him, because at some point I stopped taking it personally. I stopped looking to resolving that relationship to be happy. I just turned inside to that self that's not affected by all of that. Well, the upshot of that is I was then able to speak to him again, like after 15 years. And in speaking to him, the relationship changed immensely because I was no longer subject to being insecure about his behavior and his approach to life and his anger and so on. The long and the short of it is that he eventually heard and understood something for himself. He got curious, and he had an insight that led him to have the last 7 years of his life in happiness. So it's very powerful when people are willing to look inside. And the truth is, from my opinion, my humble opinion, you can't change anybody else anyway. And there are some lovely basic things we can do in discussion to reduce friction and help people get along and talk better. But essentially, their view of the world is what has to shift, including their view of their spouse or their partner or whatever. And that can only shift by backing up to a place where they get quiet enough to start over again, so to speak, to see it anew. That's my opinion on it anyway.
And when you just said that about getting quiet, that's what my first thought, Ankush, when you said, how would be, what would be some direct thing that we see that would help people. And for me, it's noticing that when your mind is getting really crammed with all this thinking and worrying, and if you just can notice sometimes what that feels like to be constantly, thinking, overanalyzing, and with the kind of feelings you get when you're in that state, I think people could generally pick up some help just from hearing that if you can learn to just enjoy the times when your mind is quieter, when you've just had a chance to just sit out in your garden or relax, and you notice you just have that calmer feeling. And if you start to notice that, you'll realize that that's your preference, is to have that peace and quiet. And I know everybody in the world would, it would be hard to find anyone who didn't love that feeling of peace and quiet. So when you realize that feeling is, you like it because that's when you're closer to that true self inside yourself. And so if people could just notice that and prefer that nice feeling, what happens is you gravitate more towards it, and you realize it's more possible than you thought it was, because we blame our busy minds on our circumstances again. But just enjoying that beautiful feeling. And also the other thing that I noticed really helps me is that when I take people as their behavior, then my relationship suffers. So more and more I'm learning to see that when people act a certain way or talk a certain way, that's not who they really are. There's something beautiful in there, in everybody. And when people get insecure, they don't act as friendly, or they act in all different ways. But like a lot of people would have relationships with their children where they lose that connection with their children, and they get so caught up in the children's behavior being not respectful, or some kind of negative behavior. If they can just step back, and with your partner, whoever, if you can step back and see that person is not their behavior, and just remember that we all act when we feel insecure, we act it out in our behavior. And just those ways of understanding each other, I think really helps. Still helps us.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like accepting that everybody, regardless of who they are, everybody really lives in a separate reality. Everybody lives by looking through the filter of their own thinking. So whatever they see is really created by their own thinking. Now, what's interesting for me in relationships, for instance, is over the years, as we've grown happier and enjoyed our life, and we work together, Jan and I work together, it's been surprising to me to realize that I don't know Jan after 45 or 46 years. I really don't know her. And that's a really good thing, because what it means is that my frame of reference under the label Jan is starting to melt. Because everybody's changing all the time. And the beauty of that is that as we look at each other with less and less of our belief systems about each other, we start to see that true self in that other person. We start to see the beauty in them. And they're constantly changing, and it's a beautiful thing. It's not, people talk about getting bored in their relationships. Since we've kind of found our way this way, I can't imagine being bored in our relationships. And I sometimes make the joke that I get to have a different woman every night. Happens to have the same name. But that's a beautiful thing, you start to see the newness in the other person, and you see that that's a constant thing. You see, Ankush, I bet you just spending time with your family in the last little while, you see different parts of them that you hadn't noticed before, because your belief system, your frame of reference for them is getting softer, and less solid. And I just really love that about this approach to relationships, is backing up and seeing who's really there,
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that you guys have really picked out there that are so interesting. Chip, you mentioned about babies and their true self, and one thing that I love to mention is that babies don't have a problem with connection, and babies are always naturally connected to people. And that led so nicely on to what you were saying, Jan, around people are not their behaviours.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like what you guys are pointing to is something beyond that. You're pointing to the essence of the person, and what I'm hearing you say is don't look at the behaviours, but look at what's beyond that. And what I was hearing is seeing the good in every person, seeing the true essence, and kind of having a relationship with that, as opposed to having a relationship with someone's behaviours. Again, I love what you were saying, Chip, around seeing the newness in the person all the time. And I know that I certainly change all the time. I know everyone does. And there's a lot of talk around kind of relationships that grow together.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, could you talk a little bit about that and how you see that in the context of what you're talking about? Because I know for years I'd hear about people saying, a spiritual relationship or a healthy relationship is one where both people are growing together. I'd be interested to see how you guys talk about that.
Yeah, well, I think the thing about backing up from your separate reality and getting a quiet mind is what allows that to happen. I think change is happening whether you're looking for it or not. The beauty of your mind being quieter and being less judgmental is that you see that growth in the other person. And because you like early on, we learned that we were both growing and we were both changing, we became more comfortable with the phenomena of sometimes Jan would change first and be, growing, and I'd be holding on a little bit, and then vice versa, that would happen. And it started to get So it was really neat that we were kind of playing leapfrog. We were thrilled to see the other one change and grow. Whereas before we encountered the understanding that we have, I would have been I'm jealous of that, or thinking the man should learn first. I used to be more, I'll be very honest, more, what's the word?
Chauvinist.
Chauvinist, that's the word. Now, that was a long time ago, folks, but truly, I had, those kind of beliefs, but letting that go, we now see each other growing, and we encourage it, and it's a thrill. It's like an adventure together to see each other grow. And I think a big part of that is that backing up and getting quieter so that you actually can see it. It takes the competition out of it, takes the insecurity out of it, takes all of that away so that people really are growing together. And we know hundreds and hundreds of couples that have gone from let's say not a not perfect marriage to beautiful marriage, and to really helping each other grow through the years. And I would have to say again that the primary ingredient in that was one or both of those people looked within and found that strength themselves to just drop out of the judgment and the upset and everything. And then the other person, in most cases, not all, but in most cases, has seen that and seen the reality of it and become curious. Well, once you're on that path together, once you both experience growth and you see the growth in each other, then it really becomes what I would define as a partnership, definitely.
And one thing that keeps occurring to me as Chip is sharing this is that there's a very special aspect that helps guide us through all this, because, one of us will see that the other one has caught on to something new, but the way we know is by the feeling. That's such an important ingredient for us, is that when I get a really beautiful feeling, or when Chip gets a really beautiful feeling, we automatically see in the other person that person is gaining a deeper understanding of life. It shows up immediately in a beautiful feeling. And then that starts to play out as the days go on. You see the results happen in your life, like nicer things will happen to you in, the material world, or beautiful results will come from that. But that, to me, is the what guides us, and in the years before, when we used to argue all the time, intellectually one of us would think, well, I'm right about this, and that's why we couldn't agree, because we were just living in that intellectual view of what happiness was, or what was right. And now we tend to be living from the inside, and recognizing that when somebody has a beautiful feeling, a really sincere, beautiful feeling of love, then they are on the right track. And if you're feeling out of sorts and that's bothering you or something, then it makes you kind of have to have a look. And that really does help us in our relationship.
Oh, definitely. The feeling is the guide that allows you to see where you're at. The feeling tells you, to me, whether you're caught up in your ego, your intellect, your belief system, then that's a very different feeling. Or whether you're just back looking at life with a beautiful feeling and open to seeing the other person in that new light. And if you are willing to listen to that feeling, see, you can fool yourself with your thinking. I think that's what Jain was saying, really. I'm right, I'm absolutely right. And, I could have been right until my marriage was over, became that close, so right, Or you can back up and listen to a more beautiful feeling. Like, it's so hard for us to be willing to just drop things and start over again.
As human beings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But truly, that's what we did when we first fell in love. We dropped everything and just saw the essence of the other person and wanted to be with them. And so later on, we develop all this thinking, and we think we can't just do that, but that's not true. You can do it, and that will take care of all of that thinking. And I know there'll be people listening that maybe are in deeper struggles or whatever, and they will think that perhaps that's naive. And maybe it is in some cases, I don't know, but I do know that we've watched hundreds and hundreds of marriages, some of them in much deeper trouble than we were, learn through that process and literally start over again. There's a famous video we watched where somebody was working with a couple with this approach, and we're just talking about separate realities and being willing to start over again in essence. And all of a sudden, the woman just tears up and just becomes joyful. She just went to a state of joy. And that goes back to a very simple thing, that all thoughts, every thought we have, has a feeling attached to it. Positive, neutral, or negative. Right? And if you ever find yourself in a situation where you're just willing to let go, just let it go, and just fall back into silence, happiness and joy automatically will fill the void because they really are what we are. And from that world, you look back at the world that you've been living in, and you see it with understanding, including your spouse, your partner, your kids. Now, I'd like to say just one little bit about kids. When we discovered this new understanding and started getting happier, there was a temptation to tell our kids about it. This is the way it works. Thought works like this. And our mentor just said, don't do that. They're way ahead of you. They're way ahead of you. Just leave them alone. And so we did. Well, what's really beautiful about that is once we found that feeling in our home and that happiness came into our home, our son, who was the only one around at that time, his behavior changed without any effort whatsoever. It just because he was starting to really act out naturally, given the environment that he was living in. But it just went away. And as we went through the years when our daughter came and so on, we began to see that this is just our opinion, that raising kids has much more to do with just creating a beautiful feeling and making them feel safe within that loving feeling. And I would say that's all we really did in essence with our kids, who are now very well balanced, very happy, very successful. So again, that ability to go back to square one, that person that's inside before all of that thinking, is at the root of what we think creates beautiful relationships.
Yeah, there's so much more that I want to ask you, and one thing I will say is that I loved what you said about you could have been intellectually right until your marriage ended, and I know something that I ask myself is, whenever I'm upset about anything, is do I want to be right or do I want to be happy?
Mm-hmm. I love it.
And I think that relates because sometimes I know I get caught up and think, well, I'm right, so I'm going to stick to that. And what I have to remind myself is sometimes I can't have both. I've got to choose, and actually choosing happiness rather than being right is often the far more sensible thing to do in the long term. Mm-hmm. We've pretty much run out of time now. Unfortunately, the time has absolutely flown by. I wanted to ask you so many more things. So thank you very much, Jan and Chip. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'll see the listeners next time.